Okay, thanks very much. So I'll kick off. So we are going to talk to you about our personal reflections on designing a digital badge in reflective practice in teaching as it happens. And we're going to talk about reflections on the partnership, the process and the pitfalls. So interestingly, the last piece of the last presentation there on VR, there was a reference to reflective practice in relation to the students. So I'm Siobhan Cullen, the Head of Department of Law, Public Service and Education at ATU Donegal, and my colleague is Dr. Bronagh Heverin, who is a law lecturer. And although we're both involved in law, we led the development of a National Forum funded digital badge in reflective practice in teaching. So you're probably familiar with the digital badges, and many colleagues have undertaken various digital badges which are funded by the National Forum, as I said. So we initially, way back a number of years ago, designed the digital badge in reflective practice in teaching. At that time, it wasn't fully online. It was delivered on a face-to-face basis. Then there was another iteration of the digital badges, which are fully online, which are the open source courses, as you probably know them. So myself and Bronagh were, privileged to get to lead the development of the digital badge in reflective practice. Sorry, I should say in terms of where it sits. It's aligned to the professional development framework, which you're probably familiar with. If you're not so familiar with it and want to learn more about it, it's all on the National Forum website. But the professional development framework has various domains, and one of those domains is self. And so this digital badge in reflective practice in teaching was aligned to the domain of self. Okay, so there was quite a significant team actually to this badge development. So as I say, we led it. In fact, Bronagh did most of the work in terms of leading the initiative, and we had a really interesting cross-sectoral team which comprised Dr. Orla McCormack and Dr. Mary Fitzpatrick, both from UL, Claire Gormley, who's a learning technologist in DCU, and Dr. Maura Maguire, who's head of teaching and learning at Dundalk IT, DKIT. So there are 6 of us in the development team, as I say, cross-sectoral and really interesting range of expertise and insights there. So in terms of why reflective practice, I suppose if in the spirit of reflection, if you just think for a few moments about your own discipline or your own subjects that you're involved in teaching, why would you need to be a reflective practitioner to teach those? Well, invariably, there will be an element of applied learning, practical learning, experiential learning. And in our particular discipline, which is law, we have a really significant focus on experiential learning. So we do mock trials from first year, we do mooting, debating, role plays in mediation, negotiation, and we have a work placement and a street law clinic where public legal information is given by the law students. And all of those, as with most experiential learning, are primarily assessed by way of reflection. And critical reflection is a really important aspect of experiential learning. And for many years, we've been teaching reflective practice to learners on that basis and using the various models. And we decided that reflecting on your own teaching practice would be a really good topic for a digital badge, both for those colleagues who are involved in teaching reflection to learners, but also for those who just wanted an opportunity to sit back, if you like, and reflect on their own teaching practice, and to have that aligned to an online open source course, which was incremental in its approach. So that was really the background to why we chose this topic for design of a digital badge. So I'm now going to hand over to Bronagh, whom, as I said, sort of led the development of this in practice, who's going to talk you through the process.
So, hi everybody. Obviously, let me know if you can't hear me. So I'm a law lecturer, and I was going to say LYIT. I'm still not au fait enough with my ATU Donegal denomination, but I'm in Letterkenny. And we use an awful lot of experiential learning, as Siobhan says. As a former solicitor, a lot of the modules I'm involved in are very practical, so I would be very familiar with the use of reflective practice, hence the original involvement in this project. And you'll see the first thing in relation to the process is that most national forum projects are based on the partnership model. In other words, they don't encourage institutions going solo, and they prefer to have a variety of experts and institutions. And there are a couple of reasons for that. Firstly, they hope that it maximises the quality of the course. It also should ensure relevance to as many academics as possible, and indirectly it will facilitate a greater reach of the resources created. So that was no different to the original iteration of the digital badge, which, as Siobhan says, we were asked to lead out back in 2017, but it was a wholly face-to-face version. And then at the start of 2020, they went back and they looked at setting a few, I wouldn't say that we were a pilot, but we were certainly one of the novel projects where they looked at the range of digital badges and were going to convert them all into an online format. So they came back to us and asked us to get involved in that project, and we were delighted to do it. I can summarise very briefly the process that was followed in the previous iteration. Effectively, we were asked to design a digital badge, a micro-credential, 25 hours commitment from participating academics, and that effectively we would develop the framework. Once any participant had completed the digital badge, if they did a further it varied tasks, but typically about 2 weeks or 25 hours work, well, then they would be in turn a facilitator, and they would have access to the resources to deliver the, basically to spread the delivery of these courses. In terms of preparing the course, we had great autonomy. We could do what we wanted in terms of the content, and the controlling mechanism in this original development was that we had external academics who reviewed the final product, and then we incorporated their feedback into it. So we came to this new digital version with that, experience, and apart from the conversion to online, we really didn't anticipate any huge changes. So I suppose the first thing was when they approached us with a contract. And, as lawyers, that's always great because you like to have things very clear and set out from the start. However, the irony of it was that unfortunately this was a new process, and ultimately it transpired that their plan or their contract wasn't fit for purpose, and they didn't really anticipate the nature of the work that would be required in converting this to a digital version. And to be fair to them, it was a learning experience for the National Forum and other badge developers at the same time. So the first stage in the process in the previous iteration, had been we would put together a team. And we commenced doing that, but immediately we started to experience, not immediately, but after a few weeks, the National Forum came back when we were submitted details of our team, and they wanted input into the team. And so they added 2 additional partners. As it transpired, that wasn't an issue, as in they were very welcome partners and great contributors. But in that changing of the terms of our involvement from, set the tone maybe for the engagement in the creation of this badge. But we had a team created. So what did we have to do then? Well, the first thing we had to do was establish our workspace, and we agreed to use Microsoft Teams primarily because it is was used across all of the institutions. And now I can put my hands up to being an IT illiterate here, because I've used it, but I wouldn't be in a position to vet one system over another. But the fact that everybody on the team was familiar with this particular system, we thought would make it a very easy place to work with. In terms of using it, we intended to use it as a repository for all resources, so all work in progress and indeed any final artifacts were to be stored there. It was to be used also for communication, and our communication was intended to be meetings and emails or written communications. Now, I should say that this project began in January 2020. So we had anticipated that there would be some face-to-face meetings to support all of this. But as we all know, the pandemic hit, and so we became entirely reliant on remote working. it was a good test of these resources in terms of how appropriate they were for it. And a caveat we soon learned in relation to Microsoft Teams, and I'm sure those of you who've used it have experienced it, is there can be issues in relation to guest access. So while our institution had a version of Teams, as Siobhan already alluded to, our partners were from across the country. They had their versions of Teams, but if they came onto our Teams, they were guests and didn't tend to have the same rights and powers. So that was a challenge in terms of organising meetings. In terms of communication, we had hoped that all of the written communications would be done through Teams, but again, possibly because none of us were, IT experts, quite often items were posted and other members of the team mightn't have been aware of it. I'm sure there probably is an alerting system available through Teams. We weren't privy, we didn't know how to create that and ensure that everyone thought they had it switched on, but there were communications being posted and people weren't aware of it. So we had to revert to the traditional, not quite the snail mail. We didn't put things in the post, but we did rely hugely on email. And to be fair, it worked really, really effectively. So, if it's not broken, don't fix it. Is that the right way around? I think it is anyhow. So then in terms of, we had to create the course. So ultimately we were looking to develop a 6-week programme, a session per week. They would do generally preparatory activities in advance, and then they would have post-participation activities to do as well as the reflection. In time, we learned that we would also have to create a 2-week add-on course for the facilitator accreditation for this version as well. So the challenges, I suppose, in relation to that was firstly the hosting platform. We use Blackboard. One of the other institutions used Blackboard, but they were then on a variety of other VLEs. We were in any event constrained by the National Forum VLE, which was Moodle. So that was a learning experience for some of us from the outset. And the fact that it was hosted by the National Forum created, knock-on issues then when we were delivering the course, but I'll come back to that. The second thing was that then we had to create artifacts. By converting it online, we had to create, we would be very strong advocates of interactive learning. So it wasn't a case of simply posting information. It was very much working with the information. And this required us to, explore a range of ways of doing that. Fortunately, one of the members of the team had used H5P fairly extensively and was prepared to educate the rest of us. We were going to use videos, and we had, a line-up of experts, and in particular Jenny Moon, who any of you who have been involved in reflection will recognise the name. And we were going to produce all these videos for them. And we intended in due course to instruct an instructional designer who would simply put it all together for us. So we went about creating all of I now know it's called a storyboard, but we did a plan where we knew what we were going to deliver each week, and we created the resources that would go with that. And we thought, now we've our work done, and we handed over to the instructional designer. Throughout all of that, we were hugely reliant on teamwork, and that was, I suppose, a plus. They were a great team. We were very lucky. There were no slackers or, hangers-on or freeloaders. Everybody, and the ethos of the team, fortunately, was fairly hard-working, which was great. We were also very open to constructive feedback. So the collaboration element of it worked really, really well. We decided there were 6 of us on the team. There were 6 sessions in the course. Each got to lead out a particular session. They were seconded by another member of the team who reviewed it. They took that on board, refined it, and then it was subject to a final team review before finalising it. And we had gone through all, not the actual final output, but all of the preparatory work for the final output before we instructed the instructional designer. And we retained Maureen Murray of Donegal, who was a great resource. However, we had I suppose, and this highlighted our ignorance of how you design an online course. When we passed over to her our plan, having made the videos, we had retained a videographer, but surprisingly to us, he simply wanted our participants to record on their phones, and then he edited them. So we had these packaged videos, and we handed all the materials and the videos over to DigitalEd to package our course. But unfortunately for us, we then had to go right back to the beginning, because her way of working, and in fairness, I can understand the teaching and learning, I suppose, basis of instructional designers. She had to be involved in our plan from the outset. So we now were introduced to the whole idea of storyboarding, and it was, an awful lot of extra work for us. We didn't have to do anything new as such, but we had to reword or set out in a different way our plan, and that took an awful lot of work. Ultimately, then we had the delivery, and you can see yourselves there, the trajectory of the course, an introductory session, and then there was reflection methods, critical reflection, learning how to compare reflective frameworks, building a reflective habit, and course completion and claiming your badge. All of this was delivered through Moodle, which was hosted by the National Forum, which again was a very, I suppose, a good resource to have. But it in itself had challenges. No one on the team was the owner of the platform, so we always had to get secondary access to it, which in itself is a challenge, particularly when it came to dealing with the actual delivery of the course. Small things like the registration and the access issues that participants have became, basically an extra administrative layer. They would report them to us, we would have to report them on, get them resolved, report them back. So it made it quite bureaucratic, not being the host of the platform or the owner of the platform on which it was hosted. The admin generally in relation, like this is an online course, but the administrative burden was certainly far more extensive than we anticipated. Initially, we thought once we had the package prepared, we simply, pretty much put it up and it runs itself. But there was a lot of weekly tasks in terms of uploading all of the materials, timing their release, dealing with small things like queries from participants. You want to keep your participants motivated and engaged, so you'd be putting up notices every so on. And ultimately then the administration of the award of the accreditation. In addition to that, on the screen I've showed you can see the 6 weeks of the course itself, but we also had to do a further 2 weeks add-on for facilitators, which, I suppose mirrored the same learning process. A key part of the National Forum is in relation to, and their intent here is to lessen the load for the facilitators, in that participation is facilitated by the participants primarily, as is assessment. So in all National Forum open courses, they are based on triads, where the participants are put into triads and they basically peer review their participation and ultimately their assessment. That in theory lessened the load, but as you can imagine, there's quite an administrative burden in facilitating those triads. And I'm going to, pass back to Siobhan, who's going to just briefly outline the challenges we encountered along the way.
Thanks, Bronagh. So as you can gather from what Bronagh said there was huge learning in this. And in the spirit of reflection, we wanted to be really open and honest about the challenges. The word pitfalls was used in the title here, rather than glossing over what was a huge learning and really valuable experience. But for anybody who's considering designing a digital badge, there's huge learning, and Bronagh just alluded there to the fact that, if I was doing this again, I would probably start with the instructional designer rather than design all the content and then go to an instructional designer, only to discover that they want to commence with storyboarding, a process which I now understand but didn't hitherto. So as you can gather from what Bronagh has said there, she, I suppose, bore the brunt of most of the administrative burden in terms of liaising with the participants. So in terms of the challenges, obviously the fact that we went remote in the middle of this or at the early stage of this was a challenge, which has already been explained by Bronagh. I think we worked around it really well, and we ended up having a sometimes weekly, sometimes fortnightly online meeting with the team, which is quite a significant amount of work, as you will appreciate, in the middle of an academic year. The academic contributions were entirely voluntary. Now, this was curious and is interesting, and I have to really commend the contributions of every team member on the basis that there was no academic buyout time for this. So there was funding available. The funding went to other expenditure, be it the instructional designer, the videographer, the use of other resources, but there was no academic buyout time. Therefore, that time that was spent on average, a couple of hours a week for that academic year wasn't bought out. So that was certainly a challenge. And again, commend the team, because we often met before the teaching day would commence and people were then leaving rapidly at 9:30 to go off to class. The uncertainty around the parameters of the project that Bronagh has alluded to was certainly a challenge. And again, that's probably because we were the first online digital badge to be designed, so we were in some ways a pilot, and again it's just one of the potential pitfalls in a funded pilot project. And I suppose the overarching pitfall, if you like, and you'll be familiar with this from any funded project, is having to align yourself and everything you do to the conditions of the funder, and that's challenging in itself, but the conditions changed on a number of occasions because we were a pilot. So again, I would commend the team, and I think that the great outcome was that we learned a lot. We worked really well together collaboratively and formed a great network, and we're still in touch. But I would question whether the workload for the badge developers, being academics without academic buyout time, is sustainable in terms of the digital badge model. And I think that's really probably our overarching point, that if I was giving feedback as a digital badge developer, it would be that it's much more time consuming than we envisaged, even with an instructional designer on board, and that academic buyout time would be required.
But then to finish on a positive, I guess, the rewards, well, first of all, is the open course itself, which is an enduring artifact or resource that we've now created, and effectively we ended up doing it by way of a mixture of asynchronous and synchronous sessions, effectively alternating it, because even online we as a team we felt, and certainly from the feedback from participants, they require some kind of interaction. I suppose it relates to the previous presentation where a muted uninteractive online course is very boring for everybody. So the sessions alternate between synchronous and asynchronous, but those resources are there, and it's an open course available through the National Forum, so that it is well worth doing. The second reward is colleagues and networking. Well, the first thing in terms of the team that we worked with, I mean, as Siobhan said, it was a good team. We worked well together, so they're a great resource to have nationwide. But in addition to that, the whole idea of these open courses has been available online, and the triads meant that the participants also had great networking opportunities, which hopefully they've sustained. And I suppose the last thing is it facilitated personal professional development. I don't think any of the team set out to become proficient in the development of online courses, but whether we liked it or not, we became much more proficient as a result of this experience, possibly in off the deep end, but it certainly gave us great, far greater learning than attending any online course might have. And I think that essentially concludes our presentation, other than to obviously ask if anyone has any questions.
Thanks very much. Just see if there's any questions in the chat, or if anyone wants to unmute and shout out, feel free.
We can take it as a compliment that we were as clear as mud.
Just in terms of whether anybody's wondering this, I forgot to mention that there were very positive evaluations. So if anybody's wondering, was the digital badge evaluated by the participants? There were 80 participants. Most of them stuck with it for the full duration of the course, and the evaluations were really positive. And in particular, I think they really liked the peer learning in the triads, which was the National Forum model. So just to acknowledge that, really.
Super. I was just wondering, were there, you talked about when you encountered the instructional designer, you had to redo a lot of work because you had stuff prepared, but it had to be redone. Was there, could you speak to, I know that was a lot of work to redo it, but what were the kind of changes you had to make, just out of curiosity, in relation to, like, you did storyboarding, but were there a huge amount of changes in the resources themselves, or the way they were configured, or?
Not so much in the resources themselves, because to be fair, we had created a lot of those in preparation for it. It was more the setup of how you at a very light level, I could call it formatting, but it was very prescriptive in terms of the detail you needed to put into a particular type of format, which, to be fair, made it very easy, I think, to convert it then to an online version. But I suppose, had we known that level of detail, it wasn't difficult, it was just time consuming.
Yeah.
And I learned a lot. I hadn't ever designed an asynchronous learning piece. So I suppose I now know that I would start with storyboarding and work from there rather than do it backwards. So the instructional designer was extremely patient and gave us a lot of time, but it was, I suppose, probably more time consuming than we had anticipated. And there were one-to-one sessions where we talked her through from the beginning to the end our piece, and then she converted it. So it was a very thorough job and a really good job, and we were delighted with the outcome, but way more time consuming than we had expected.
It always is.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't see any other questions coming through here.
Great.
Have we any here in the room? No? Okay, folks, thanks a million. And how many are you going to roll this out? Like 80 have done it so far, and it's asynchronous. So are there people joining all the time to do it, or do you open and close it at certain dates?
Well, effectively, of those 80 who did it, another 30 of them trained as facilitators. So exactly, the resources are available to them. The idea would be that it's basically repeated locally all over the place.
Ah, okay.
You know, so to be fair, that the National Forum manages that now, you know, in terms of, you know, the resources are openly available for anybody to go into the National Forum, as are all the open courses. So they're a great resource if anybody has an area of interest. It's certainly a good first stop shop.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you.
Cheers.
Thanks.
Thanks.